Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. First of all, I want to thank Andrea Harris, that's coming from very far away. And we have great representatives from Canada today. So Andrea Harris, Vice President of Impact Strategy at Vancity, based in Vancouver, British Columbia. And we have Jérôme Pitigny online, leading climate change, biodiversity, and ESG data at Desjardins. And hopefully soon we'll have Sasha Matovic from PCAF, or Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials. So just giving a brief introduction, UNFCU was very proud to sign for PCAF last year in December. That reflects a commitment that we have for transparency and collaboration with the financial sector. We are also very eager to do our data accountability for portfolio emissions. So with that, I'll get started. And I guess another brief introduction, given that Sasha is not here, but I'll fill in a bit. So for the ones who don't know, PCAF is a methodology that was created by the financial institutions for the financial sector, and it's more or less new. There's only few credit unions that have joined it, and recently I attended the PCAF update for signatories in Climate Week, and it was very enriching, and also felt really good to realize that everybody is kind of on the same boat. We're learning by doing. The methodology is there, but we are, when I say we, the financial sector and financial institutions are shaping it to be more accurate. There's some data challenges, but at the same time, even if the data is not perfect, it is really a tool to know how can financial institutions measure really their impact. So once you measure, then you can design projects or programs that can actually tackle it. So that's my introduction from Sasha, I hope. With that said, Andrea, so let's keep it real here. Vancity is known in Canada for being a very strong institution regarding ESG and reporting and climate. And I actually noticed your amazing climate report, and I saw the evolution from, I believe, 3 years ago, the comparison from 3 years ago to now, which is, at least regarding the TCFD, astonishing, from like 3 sheets to, several. So if you can tell me a little bit of highlights and your experience about the background and evolution of Vancity.
In a reporting.
In that reporting,
okay.
Yeah.
Super, yeah. Back in 2002, I believe. It's also a separate report, and then moved to integrated reporting a few years after that. So all to say that we have had a long history of accountability reporting and reporting out on environmental and social impacts using the GRI framework largely. For those of you that were in the session previously, we're grateful for the work that the GRI does, and that we've engaged with them for many years. And then in 2019, we committed to PCAF and to reporting out our financed emissions. And in 2020, did our first financed emissions disclosure using the guidance from the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosures, TCFD. I was going to complain about acronyms, and then I realized I was in the UN building, and I wasn't going to get very far with this crowd. But I do need a cheat sheet because I can't remember all these acronyms myself. So apologies for that. At the same time, in 2021, around the same time in 2021, we became a signatory to the Principles for Responsible Banking, the PRB, and started doing self-assessment reporting as a part of that commitment as well. 2022, we set interim targets that are running out this year, actually, so we're resetting them this year. And in 2022, we did our first separate climate report. Partly just a practical issue, the requirements for reporting out on financed emissions and as well as our operational emissions, it became too large. And so we needed a separate report. So it's been a long journey, I would say, for those of you who are starting this journey. I know this is the advanced track, but don't despair. Please don't follow the same journey that we've followed. Try and leapfrog and get, follow the guidance, some of the commentary from the previous panel around, find that appropriate level of reporting on issues that are most material to you and start there. I think that was great guidance. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. That's great. And please don't tell me don't follow us, because you are really, really strong and you're like really amazing regarding the advances that climate reporting and pretty much ESG. I'm a fan of your reports. So, and moving on to Jérôme, actually, maybe giving it some step backward, can you tell us a little bit? So what's finance emissions, just to give that definition there, and then also regarding your ESG strategy. So like Vancity, Desjardins, it's quite advanced, and could you tell us a little bit about your ESG journey? How did that reporting begin, and why is this important? Why are finance emissions important?
Sure, and apologies for not being there today, but I'm happy to be here with you guys. Finance emissions, in a nutshell, it's really about trying to assess the impact of a financial institution on the economy. So to put it very simply, a financial institution role is to take money somewhere, our members and clients, and put it somewhere else, loans and investments. It's a very simplistic view. It's not our only role, obviously. But when we think about that, our main impact is where we are allocating money in the world. So that's where we need to measure things and where we have an influence. And so when we think about a climate strategy for financial institutions, and I will speak for Desjardins here, obviously, we need to have a strategy focusing on our lending activities and our investments as well. And that's what we launched in 2021 with our 2040 net zero ambition. It was not the first climate strategy for Desjardins. Basically, ESG is not new. We have launched, I think, our first ESG environmental fund actually in 1990, so more than 30 years ago. But that was basically in the process and building blocks on each other during the past 30 years. If we speak about reporting, so similar to Vancity, a lot of reports along the years. So first CSR report, I would say, was launched in 2007, following the GRI guidelines as well. Our first CDP disclosure, so Carbon Disclosure Project questionnaire, was published in 2013, and our first TCFD disclosure in 2018. So we are working on our seventh climate report right now, and we signed on PCAF in 2020. So I think just a year behind you from that, Sasha. Maybe why it's important. I think we need to think a bit more about that. So obviously, from an external point of view, we need to provide transparency. We need to create trust and accountability. And we simply need to demonstrate our progress on our climate objectives. So that's the main thing about reporting. It's not only about regulations. It's about showing, explaining what we are doing and why. But I would say do not forget about the role of internal reporting as well. Basically, we need to raise awareness. We need to explain why we are doing that. And we need to create a bit of tension, of motivation and engagement with our executives. So saying that something will be reported publicly is helping you a lot to work on that with your executives, with other teams as well. And it's basically a good way to start working on PCAF emissions.
Thank you, Jérôme. Thank you for that explanation. And we have Sasha here. We're going to give her a little bit of we'll give her a little bit of breathe. And in the meantime, Jérôme, just a follow-up of what you were mentioning, you said, let's also keep the reporting internally. Could you tell us how have you shaped conversations and what has been the process internally for Desjardins regarding finance emissions reporting?
Sure. So it's, I would say, two main objectives, and then I will speak about the process. But the first objective is was really to increase awareness. So before even signing on PCAF, we did use the methodology to think about, okay, where are our finance emissions in the organization? Is it more from our banking portfolio, retail mortgages, or corporate lending? Is it more about investments? So we needed to have a first cut, a rough estimate, basically, of our finance emissions. And based on that, we had some good discussions internally at the executive level to explain that, yes, we were quite good about publishing basically our operational GHG emissions, buildings, business travel, etc. But it was less than 1% of our GHG emissions, direct and indirect. So we really needed basically to focus on those 99% in order to have an impact. So that was the, I would say, added understanding that finance emissions brought to the table at Desjardins. The second benefit of having those numbers was basically to implement climate targets. It's nice to talk about a long-term climate emission, so net zero 2040, net zero 2050, but it's very vague. It's far in the future. And so we need to have something a bit more ready to action. And the idea is to understand what is our impact, where are the pockets of influence, basically, that we can use. And in a nutshell, as we say, what gets measured gets done. So we really need to focus to be able to identify the companies, the products, financial products that are contributing the most to climate change, and basically to work on those.
Thank you, Jérôme. I completely agree. What gets measured gets changed. So having said that, I'm going to address a little bit of that question with Andrea. You mentioned some objectives, and if you can tell us a little bit of what those, and you mentioned that you subscribe also to some organizations. I believe you mentioned UNPRB. Can you tell us how does those commitments link to your relationship with finance emissions and PCAF? And also along the lines of what Jérôme mentioned of conversation internally, how does it all comes together?
That's a great question. How does it all come together? I think you can think of it as two sort of sets of commitments. We've made commitments as a signatory to PRB. We are a founding member of the Global Alliance for Banking on Values, which has commitments aligned to that as well as reporting requirements. We've signed on to we are members of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. So those are all, hard commitments that have specific requirements that come with it. And then I would say there's a second category, which is more the commitments that get our employees excited, that our board is really behind, and help galvanize kind of that internal change and help us talk to our members. And so in 2021, we publicly made 5 climate commitments. The first was net zero by 2040. That's related to PRB. The second was a commitment around climate justice, because our board felt very strongly, and rightly so, that getting net zero is critical, but how we get there is equally important. And so that's still evolving, but that's very much related to a commitment to equity that we already had in place. We have had a long-term value around reconciliation with Indigenous people. And in 2020, we also made a commitment to be an anti-racist organization. And so that second public climate commitment is all intersected with those themes and other commitments as well. The third commitment is 100% responsible investments. We've never lent to oil and gas, but our investments was something that we needed to take a look at, and that's what reporting helped us identify as well, to Jérôme's earlier point. The fourth commitment is an ongoing commitment to transparency and accountability, which is, why I say we've done a lot of reporting. I was being a little bit facetious around saying don't follow us, but it's like find the right size. I think we may have overdone it in some cases. And then the fifth commitment is really about walking the talk. So critical in the topic of climate. If you're going to go out, because to reduce financed emissions, that means you have to work with your members and convince them that they need to reduce their emissions. The only way to do that is if you've gone through the muck of trying to do it yourself. And so we've, we were carbon neutral, first financial institution to be carbon neutral in 2008. That's an outdated term and all of that, but it was really important to build that authenticity. And now we have a commitment to continue to reduce our operational emissions. It's been hard, and sharing those stories with our members has been really powerful.
Thank you, Andrea. I know I really appreciate what you're saying of giving a step back and then analyzing how that links to the actual products you're serving to the members. Now, Sasha, we would love to hear from you. So here, do you have any trends regarding financial institutions, perhaps of credit unions, regarding the use of PCAF and on their strategy?
Yeah, so for background, just in case no one's aware of this, to measure and disclose financed emissions for loans and investments for financial institutions. And around Andrea's first point was transparency and accountability was the driving force for this, especially through standard development. So we create guides and templates on how you can measure and calculate financed emissions in a very structured way. We also provide resources to do that. But that's what PCAF is. And then I think your second part of the question was in terms of data collection, correct? Like how institutions are collecting data, how they're using it?
It was on trends, yeah, how institutions are using your methodologies, and have you seen changes in how they report?
Yes. So we have seen quite a few changes. So when financial institutions, especially smaller institutions like credit unions, first started, we were getting a lot of questions on like what is the standard? How do I apply the standard? Like nuances in the calculations to make sure they were like integrated into internal systems. And then since then, we've seen a large expansion in more broad and overarching questions because the standard is quite broad on like what is a business loan, what is project finance. And so a lot of what the classifications were internally for some of these investments didn't match what PCAF was saying those investments are. And so we had a lot of institutions asking us like, well, what is debt? How do we measure debt? Like, what is debt? And then from that, how can we apply these standards to different asset classes internally that we might not classify the same way as you do? And then also, how can we use these standards to calculate emissions for asset classes that might not already be included in your standards? Because although our standards are pretty comprehensive, there's a few asset classes that aren't necessarily covered, but are similar enough that people are like, well, we want to have full portfolio coverage, so how can we use these standards to do so? And a lot of that comes from these broad overarching questions. And I will say our technical assistance team is loving it because these questions are a lot more interesting for them than necessarily like, how do I do this calculation? But we've seen a lot more of those types of questions, which has been really, really great and also stimulates a lot of standard expansion for us, which is great because standard expansion is driven by FIs. So it's a holistic, feedback session, but that's the biggest trend we've seen.
And a follow-up on that. So I was in Climate Week in the PCAF session a few weeks ago, and I remember and I was very interested by several financial institutions, actually big and small, with concerns of data accuracy and data challenges and lack of data. So do you have any recommendations regarding how financial institutions should approach this, or pretty much any highlights that you would like to provide regarding data challenges?
Yeah, I'm more than happy to. Data challenges are, in my opinion, the number one challenge institutions face, especially towards the beginning of this journey. And so it's good to know this is a journey. It's not going to be like the be-all, end-all on your first disclosure that you have everything right and you have full coverage and all of those things. So it's a combination of being flexible with what you have and maybe the asset class level, data quality level you're reporting by asset class, but also working with your own like financial institution to start collecting new data and then integrating that new data into internal systems in an appropriate way. And I think the largest struggle I've seen is that there's not a single person at each entity that's like designated to be like that data lead for specific asset classes, or they don't have accountability over that data. And so designating people in your organization to be those champions to say, okay, I own this process, I own this data collection process, any of that really helps. It also, gets your organization more excited to be doing it because people are like tied into it. But those are some of the best practices I've seen.
Thank you. I'm definitely going to bring that to UNFCU. No, that's a real important point. Speaking of data, Jérôme, I would like to, you've been immersed in data collection, as even your title says. So I would love to know what have been the challenges at Desjardins regarding data and any insights that you can provide for us to avoid those or have a better approach.
Sure. Maybe. So let's start with the good news, I would say. So good news is probably some asset classes, so PCAF asset classes, are not too complicated, and we do have good data. So I'm thinking about like listed equity, corporate bonds, motor vehicle loans. So this is working pretty well, and we do have access to external data helping us to basically have good finance emissions for those asset classes. That being said, we are working a lot to increase the data quality for other asset classes. And the key challenge, I would say, is to get data, like real economic data at a granular level for many of our lending activities. That's probably the main challenge that we are facing right now. And I'm speaking about mortgages, real estate, agricultural loans, many other type of loans in the economy. And this data challenges is basically taking different shapes and forms. Sometimes the data is just not existing. So for instance, the GHG emissions of a small or medium enterprise of a farm, quite often basically the company is just not measuring that. It's hard to ask them the question. Sometimes there is some data, but it's not collected by our folks, our staff basically on the ground. Or it's not properly organized to be used. And for instance, the square footage of housing, heating systems, energy sources, these kind of things, we are collecting this information, but we are losing it along the way. So we need to improve processes internally. We need also to think about, for large organizations, how to share data internally. And that seems like an easy way, an easy fix to find. It's not that easy, to be honest. What we have seen is that sometimes it's very hard for basically the banking side of the institution to share data with the corporate level because of privacy concerns, security concerns. And so that's something that is hindering the work that we are doing on financial emissions. And the last one that was not that present at the beginning because we were not that sophisticated, but it's getting more and more of an issue, is basically being able to properly split the financial statements at the corporate level into the different PCAF categories. So once again, it sounds pretty easy to do. So for mortgages, very easy. When we look at project finance, at direct investments in real estate and commercial real estate, this is not something that we find usually in the financial statements. And then when the finance teams are coming and trying to basically assess what we are doing and help us doing so, it's a lot of good discussions between different worlds, like the ESG world and the finance world. So different teams, different ways of seeing things, even if it should be less complicated than that. Thank
you, Jérôme. So speaking of what you were saying, speaking with internal teams, what's your experience with engaging them from bringing the data to actually set up targets. So pretty much, how do you bring the data and engaging internal teams to set up targets internally?
I think we need to distinguish, basically, to split the discussion between measuring finance emissions and setting targets. And it's two different topics, really. So measuring is basically taking a snapshot of your portfolio and translating it into GHG emissions. So it's complicated, it's not easy, but it's doable. Setting targets is something else. And I really liked what Andrea was saying about we need to work with our clients, with our members, and make sure that if we want to decrease the GHG emissions of our portfolio, they are working on their emissions. And that's the hard part, to be honest. So to set targets, we need to use recognized methodologies that are science-based, so SBTi, for instance, and others. We need to be transparent about how we will be setting targets, what are the assumptions, these kind of things. What is the strategy behind that as well to achieve those targets? It's important. And also to be transparent about the reporting. So we need to, at least annually, explain where we are. And if we are on track, that's good. If we are not, we need to explain why. And that's not easy. It's probably easier from an ESG perspective, but from a corporate perspective, it's not that easy to explain this kind of bad news. One key question is the level of ambition, especially when we are going granular. So for instance, if we split a target into real estate or energy, we will need to make sure that we are setting an appropriate level of ambition. And that's where usually it's very tough, even for progressive organizations, to basically match what the science is asking with what the economy is doing right now. And there is a disconnect. And a usual question for our banking, basically account managers, etc., is how can we achieve a decarbonization target in an economy that is not moving away from carbon fossil fuels? That's a good question, especially if we don't want to simply exclude members and clients from the portfolio. So we need to think about decarbonization targets, and we need to think about transition targets. And those are two different things, because the transition targets are usually more business-oriented. It's about where do we put money, basically, so loans, investments, into transition sectors. And that's where I think financial institutions need to think probably as much as decarbonizing the portfolio. Because just decarbonizing from an absolute point of view is it's not that hard. We exclude the bad players, but it's not working in the real economy. It doesn't have an impact at the end of the day.
Right. Thank you so much, Jérôme. So you speak about setting targets, and then if we are advancing to a net zero world, I'm going to jump into you, Andrea. You have amazing, and challenging, ambitious targets. So how do you keep it meaningful, realistic, yet also ambitious to set up these targets? I mean, I know you mentioned you already committed to certain standards such as the UNPRV, but what about the interim targets? Like how do you know you're going to be able to do it? Or do you know?
I don't. Listen, we have our big, hairy, audacious goal of being net zero by 2040. And then with any of those types of goals, you have to break it down into bite-sized pieces. And I really like what Jérôme spoke to. And for us, that has meant, yes, targets around emissions, but it's also meant targets around engagement. And so, especially with our small business members, and now even with our retail members, our mortgage holders, we've shifted gears a little bit to put more emphasis on setting targets around the number of conversations our frontline staff have with our members, with the theory of change being that will eventually lead to action and investments in retrofitting their homes or building transition plans if they're a business. But it really has to start with the conversations, and then we're hoping it will all ladder up to reduced emissions. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrea. No, that's great. I think like it makes sense to make that connection and to make it work. So moving on to the conclusion block, Sasha, you mentioned some resources that previously. Would you be able to share some of this and pretty much tell us some of the ones that you think would be helpful for credit unions and any other recommendations or tools that you can provide?
Sure. Yeah, PCAF has a lot of resources. I'll probably walk through like 4 of the main ones that are really helpful at the beginning. So when you start your decarbonization journey, before you start, you want to know how to do it. And so PCAF has created something called the PCAF Academy, which is like LinkedIn Learning. It's modules. It's an online learning portal. Every signatory that joins gets as many licenses they want within reason, so that your team can start to learn about decarbonization, how to measure it, and then the different asset classes in which you can do those calculations. And then once you have your footing on how you can start this journey, we offer tons of resources, but some of the biggest ones are our PCAF database, which provides emission factors for your team to use to say, like, okay, we have this amount outstanding in this loan. This is an emission factor we can use to calculate the emissions for those dollars invested. And so that's one of the biggest hurdles at the beginning, is to find these emission factors and then have the data that complements it in your internal system. So that's a huge resource, especially to smaller financial institutions that might not have diligent resources to go out and find these third-party emissions factors. Another one is our technical assistance team. So I mentioned them earlier. They love broad overarching questions, but they're always there to support on any question that you have. So if you email them, you can email them like literally dummy data and say, like, is my calculation okay? Am I doing this right? If you want to send them an Excel, you can join their office hours where you can ask questions in an open forum about the standard. There's tons of ways you can get, and they also answer any database question too, so if you're having technical issues that way. But they're a really good resource for anyone starting out, especially because there are a ton of questions, and there is parts of the standard that are open to interpretation, so that's a really nice resource, in my opinion. And then the last big one is our regional teams. So in North America in particular, we just have one regional team that encompasses Canada, the US, and I think technically Mexico, but it's just Canada and the US at this point. And so our regional teams set up these working groups, and what those working groups are is groups that meet quarterly or sometimes more frequently on different topics. So, for example, we have business loans. We also have a Canadian working group, which I think you guys might be part of. But those different working groups foster collaborative thinking and knowledge sharing. And so what we're seeing is, like, especially on ones where there might not have been excellent third-party data, like motor vehicles, for instance, we saw a lot of institutions sharing, like, well, we found this one database that might help you tag vehicles better, because the tagging to make them attached to an emission factor wasn't like very well built out for North America in particular. But there was a lot of like knowledge sharing around those particular topics, or like, you know, overarching questions about like, how did you apply this standard? And so the knowledge sharing is really amazing. I will say even our regional events are really great for that. The PCAF event that we all attended, I saw a lot of like fostering knowledge sharing and collaboration, especially among newer FIs. I had a newer FI in my breakout room, and we had like 3 different signatories who set up one-on-one meetings for like an hour the next week to walk them through like, how do you start this? Because they were very overwhelmed. And so I will say, like, that spirit of collaboration runs through every part of PCAF, and I think it's one of the biggest advantages, especially when you're first starting out, because it is overwhelming, and you'll find challenges, and so having that network is really, really helpful.
Thank you, Sasha. No, I agree. I think events like that really help you realize that everybody's on the same boat, and we are all struggling but also advancing at the same time. So finalizing here, for Andrea and Jérôme, what advice would you offer credit unions, professionals, and stakeholders to improve their climate strategies or environmental strategies? We'll start with Jérôme.
Apologies, I was mute. So a few key advice. Start simple, as usual. You don't need to have everything figured out to start. So don't wait until you think perfection will be there. Do not be shy about reaching out. So reaching out externally, and I think Sasha was really good about explaining why PCAF working groups and PCAF staff is useful, but also reach out to other financial institutions, to be honest. We had some good discussions with competitors on how to measure, like on the methodological aspects, because this is pretty competitive. It's not about trying to define the business strategy. It's about trying to have the same, basically, level playing field to make sure that we are measuring the same way our finance emissions. And it's about helping each other for a greater cause, I would say, even if it seems a bit idealistic. So reach out also internally. So I was speaking about that. Usually, PCAF like finance emissions are starting with the ESG sustainability teams, but we cannot do it alone. We really need basically to work with the finance teams, with the risk teams, and with the business lines as well, to understand what are the business activities, what this loan is about exactly, and this kind of things. We also need to involve other functions that are less often involved in those kind of ESG calculations. Audit, internal audit, legal is more and more important given the current ESG and greenwashing atmosphere, I would say. So these kind of things and teams are really necessary. And please get the tone at the top. You cannot do it alone without an executive commitment. So that's as simple as that. And maybe to conclude, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Like start somewhere and publish. It's better to be transparent about where you are than to do nothing.
Thank you. Andrea?
To add, except, hey, read other people's climate reports. We read Desjardins with a fine-tooth comb. That's really helpful. I think the point about auditors and tone at the top, I would say that's critical. With PCAF, we're always said, start, and it's highly estimated, but that's okay. The thing is, you're dealing with boards and external auditors who've dealt with financial data. It's not highly estimated. It's very precise. So this is a really different muscle for them in a very different space. So working with your governors to help them govern in this kind of ambiguity, I'd say, is a huge challenge and something to also be mindful of, and bring them along in the journey and share with them what you're facing. That's all I'd add.
Great, thank you. No, that's helpful. And just to finish, a lightning round, 3 words. What's a target or accomplishment you're most proud of, and why? In 3 words. No, it could be a sentence, but really short. Jérôme, go ahead.
Target is probably our renewable energy sector targets. And accomplishment, it's a larger ESG program basically to transform the organization on risk, data, and climate disclosure. And we stop here, given the number of words.
Thank you. Thank you. Andrea and then Sasha.
Yeah, for me, it's around integrating climate with equity. I think that's really important to me. And so what I'm proud of is when I hear stories of when that comes together, when I hear an Indigenous member say, this is the first time I have felt comfortable in my home.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Sasha? You're not going to get 3 words or 3 sentences out of any of us, I'm sorry. I would say from a PCAF perspective, I think, especially leading North America, the breadth and depth of not only the FIs we have, but the creativity of those FIs and the knowledge sharing has been one really big one. And then I think it's also like reducing anxiety around the first disclosure, I think has been some of my proudest accomplishments, because I've had so many FIs walk in and like so stressed out, especially smaller credit unions across the US. And so showing them, walking them through one example calculation and literally seeing the weight come off of them. I've seen it on calls. I asked if I could film it once. And so seeing that is, I think, like one of the biggest things, because getting people over that hurdle and
realizing like we're all in this boat, this is where we are, has been a really, really rewarding and fulfilling thing for me personally.
Thank you so much. Well, with that, I would say thank you. Thank you for the panel. We learned a lot. I thought this was great to get a sense of credit unions. What is really happening with PCAF, and then having here the real source from PCAF North America also helps clarify questions. And we're looking forward to see everyone tomorrow. Any questions, and then we can leave and escape to the tour, maybe, or just take a break.
Do a credit union really need to be working these numbers? What is the additional resource lift for staffing in order to start a project like this?
Desjardins, Jérôme, do you have, can you tell us how many people are working on these calculations in your company?
Sure. I will probably give you the number at the start. It was me. Then 6 months after, we were 2 because we were covering more asset classes. And now I would say we are probably, depending on the business units. If you have a business unit view, it's probably 2 or 3 people. So 1 or 2 analysts and 1 manager to basically stamp that the numbers are good. But that's like people who are working mostly on that. And then you probably need other teams to take a look at those numbers as well. It's a larger number at the end.
Thank you. And I guess we shouldn't be discouraged. I guess we start with 1 and then we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
On average.
Definitely.
It's usually like someone who oversees the process and then an analyst. That tends to be like a good starting number, and then you build out as you have more portfolio coverage.
And we had interns. Anybody? Sophia, other people? Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. No, that's a good question. Any other questions?
I do have a quick question, if I may. I think this was amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I appreciate this idea that it's a journey, and I really, we take that to heart. And we also heard really clearly, just start where you are, that you're not expected to be at the number 1 quality data yet, but when are we? I think that's the really honest answer. You mentioned governance, and you mentioned sort of, that expectation that at some point we would be there. And so I would love to kind of hear, is it okay that the industry is kind of at that 3, 4, or whatever that number is? And how long can we be there for quality data?
I have seen a spectrum of answers to this. I know a lot of very large FIs with a lot of resources who are comfortable staying at a 4 or 5 forever, which is shocking because they have a lot of audit and oversight, but they're perfectly comfortable doing that. And then I've seen much smaller institutions who have gone for a level 1 data quality within a few years. And it really depends on your level of engagement. And I think, especially in North America, we're really starting to see that, and especially as regulation and compliance starts to force it, we'll see more and more of it. But I think, in general, within the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see a very large shift into what you have available to you and then what you can disclose, because it needs to start at the company level, and we're not seeing that just yet.
If no one else has any questions,
Jérôme,
do you have a comment?
Yeah, I can have a comment on that. So local regulators, at least in Canada, are not asking for a quality level. But it's not about regulation. It's more about if you have targets on your finance emissions, like having quality level 5 or even 4 will not help you. Basically, it will be just a reflection of the amount of money you have in a portfolio. So outstanding amount or asset under management. So if you really want to manage basically the companies and the composition of the portfolio, you need to move to quality 1, 2, maybe 3. So that's I would say that's my best answer on that. Other than that, it's mostly a heat map design exercise.
Thank you. Okay, with that, I would say we finalize the panel, and please reach out. We have here wonderful sources of information and knowledge, and even if you have questions for me in our beginning journey regarding PCAF, I will be welcome to share some information. Thank you, everyone.